And then interestingly, I think often the things that we notice is not just the grid itself, but where we made some changes or did not follow the grid. So maybe you'll find some of those familiar. And then we'll talk about the legacy that brought us up today before we get to some questions and answers. So before the grid, believe it or not, this is a reconstruction of what the area around Chinatown in Manhattan would have looked like possibly a couple hundred or even a couple thousand years ago, right? Looks like undisturbed nature, although if we look closely, we might see some signs of human habitation. There's a beautiful freshwater pond. We forget that Manhattan is surrounded by salt water, so fresh water has always been very important to us. But if we want to know how Manhattan got here in the first place, we have to go back about 15,000 years to the last ice age, when the Wisconsin glaciation, the Laurentide ice sheet, had pushed down from the Arctic for years and years and years and years, these over 1,000-foot thick sheets of ice, pushing ahead of them a big wave of dirt and rocks, almost like they were a broom scraping the topsoil ahead of them. And you can see that they covered the entire area where we are now, but they stopped here because the ice age was ending and the climate was changing. And the glaciers dropped their big load of rocks and soil, and it became a big bump of land that we call a terminal moraine. That formed all the way from today's Staten Island through Long Island, all the way up to Cape Cod in Massachusetts, a big bump of land. But then the glaciers themselves melted, and they forced a passage through that dam right where you see the Narrows called out that forms New York Harbor. Manhattan survives all this scraping because it is a long, narrow prong of very hard bedrock. And in fact, you can still see that bedrock if you know where to look. Central Park is a great place to do it. But this creates this interesting, familiar landscape today where we have kind of all these little islands that are protected from the worst of ocean weather and storms and a natural deep water harbor. So human beings have always said, this is a very nice place to be. And in order to track the changes in Manhattan over time, I'm going to take the liberty of isolating the island and turning our map sideways. So when you look at this map here, which is still a wilderness, although I can see that little pond down at the left, uptown is to your right. And one of the other things that you're going to notice immediately is the long axis of Manhattan Island does not run perfectly north-south. It's actually turned about 29.6 degrees eastward, if you see my north arrow up there. So let's keep that in mind. Wall Street and downtown would be on our left. Harlem and uptown would be on our right. And of course, the earliest residents of this area were Native Americans. And the folks who came to occupy Manhattan and adjacent areas called themselves the Lenni Lenape. Like a lot of indigenous names, it just meant the people. And this is a European reconstruction of what we think one of their settlements on the southern tip of the island might have looked like, but they occupied this area very happily along with other groups for thousands and thousands of years until the arrival of Europeans began a series of displacements of them, not just from Manhattan, but from most of our entire region. You can see some of the descendants of the Lenape at the top right in 1915 who had been pushed as far west as reservations in Oklahoma. But people are connecting more and more to their local heritage. You can see some people marching in the Indigenous Peoples Parade from the Ramapo-Munsee language-speaking Lenape Nation, because there were even subgroups that spoke different languages here. And we have a landscape that existed in Lenape, Manhattan, that really has very few traces today. The dotted lines you see here are trails that went up and down between various settlements. There were probably over 3,000 Native Americans living here. Because we're surrounded by salt water, if you look at the left on my map, you'll see that little blue dot of the freshwater pond where the village called Werepose was, all the way down by Wall Street, Capsea, where people collected oysters out of the harbor before we polluted it later. Then in places like Rectank and Shempos along by today's East Village and let's say maybe Gramercy Park area. Over on the west side in what is today's Chelsea and Meatpacking District was Sappohannock, named for the tobacco that was raised there. And you can see a crossroads called Kintakoying, not too far from today's Union Square, which was called the Crossroads of the Three Nations, where even several different Lenape groups of different language types would get together and trade. So this is already, before Europeans get here, a cosmopolitan area. But importantly also, check out the long trail that runs up the island, a little crooked path, and then it kind of goes east for a ways. We call that the Wickagasset Trail, because the Lenapes would use it to visit their friends, the Wickassets, who lived up in today's Westchester. So that was the way you would get up there. The Muskota Flats and wetlands close to today's Harlem, and further off to the right, a place called Shorakopach, which will become important because some interactions between the Lenape and Europeans happened there. So this is the original human landscape of Manhattan Island. But our story of New York City, of course, really begins with Europeans. And as opposed to a lot of the rest of New England, where the English came here first, the first arrivals in Manhattan are the Dutch. They come here from Holland, from the Netherlands and Europe, on behalf of the Dutch West Indies Company to do some trading. And you can see a little glimpse of the trading post town that they put on the southern tip of Manhattan that they called New Amsterdam, right after the capital of the Netherlands, where they are from. And it occupied just the very southernmost tip of the island. You can see a little fort. They hooked up to that Native American trail, the Wickagasset Trail, and that became the Herenstraat, the Gentleman's Street, which we will recognize later turning into parts of Lower Broadway. And of course, they fortify the northern end of this with a log palisade, a kind of a wall, which becomes the path of today's Wall Street. And if we want to put this in context on our comparison map, you can see that the Dutch are just starting off at the very leftmost point, right? The rest of the island is still Lenapehoking, Native American land, but the Dutch in the 1620s and 1630s rapidly begin putting some little farms and settlements. One of the names for farm and orchard was a bowerie, which gives its name to some places on the Lower East Side and even a road that we see. They called that freshwater pond the Kolk, which was just their name for a little body of water. And they made their way up through the island, through the Kromme Mersje, the Crooked Swamp, today's Gramercy, Kip's Bay, where the Kip family lived, that still has its name, Doughtle Bay, named for a kind of woodworking dowel that the British would mistranslate as Turtle Bay. And you can see that they're still using that path of the Wickagasset Trail to get themselves up to places like Bloemendaal, part of the Upper West Side that reminded them of a place with a valley of flowers from the Netherlands, and New Harlem, a separate little residence named after another town. And I saw that Elizabeth is checking in from the Bronx, which used to be the farm of a fellow by the name of Jonas Bronx. So when you said, well, I'm going up to Bronx Farm, we eventually decided that CKS was too much trouble to spell it, and that gave us the X that we know today. So from the 1620s to the 1660s, this is the Dutch layout of the island. But the British are expanding throughout the area, and in 1664, the Duke of York sponsors an expedition to take over the town from the Dutch. The British sail in with overwhelming military force and rename the town New York. But the Dutch remain and still contribute a lot to the character of our town. This is a view from outside of the British town of New York, looking down again from today's Chinatown past that freshwater pond, which had a big hill next to it, looking down to Trinity Church and other places along the Wall Street area. Eventually, this pond, which the British came to call the Collect in another mistranslation of the Kolk, would get polluted, and we'd cut down that big hill, Bayard's Mount, to fill the pond in. Here's a view of British New York, a little bit angled, but you can see I've called out a dashed line where Wall Street was, and by the 1760s, the town is twice as big. It's bumping up against that freshwater pond. It's gotten up to about what we would call City Hall Park today. And if we want to put that on our comparison map, here's how much things have changed. You can see that yellow zone to the right continues to expand. Now there's not just Wall Street where the wall was, but the British have renamed de Herenstraat the Broadway, right? But interestingly, at this point, the main road we're using out of town is the road that we still today call the Bowery, right? The one that went out to the old Dutch boweries or farms, where Peter Stuyvesant and his family had some. And we can continue to see some wealthy British families like the Warrens that take some land there. They've even made a little settlement about 2 miles outside of town that reminds them of the British town of Greenwich. This will, of course, become Greenwich Village. And you can see that we've changed the Wickagasset Trail a little bit. They've now made it come across to go to that Upper West Side Bloomingdale area, and they call it the Bloomingdale Road. For those of you who are curious, there is no connection to Bloomingdale's, the department store. That was founded by some later German immigrants with a similar name, Blumenthal. But the east side of the old Wickagasset Trail has now become the Boston Post Road that goes all the way up to Boston, and the Murray family has settled in there in what will become Murray Hill today. Importantly, for our story, between the Bloomingdale Road and the Boston Post Road are some rocky grounds that are not considered very valuable that the British Crown grants to the city, and these become known as the common lands. So let's keep those in mind. At this point, I want to zoom in a little bit on the edge of town. So I've rotated my map back with uptown being north to be in an area that is today's Tribeca, Soho, and East Village. But what you can see is that these are originally farms. On the west side is a farm belonging to Trinity Church, which got a big grant of land from the British government. A little further up in today's Meatpacking District is the Warren family's farm, stretching up to Greenwich and Gansevoort streets. Then in the middle of town, the Bayard family, who had been important since Judith Bayard married Peter Stuyvesant all the way back in the 1600s, have a farm that they eventually split up into two pieces. And on the east side is the estate of the British de Lancey's, stretching up to North Street, which we'll eventually call Houston Street. As the city began expanding into these areas, these folks divided up their farms and started to sell them off so that people could build houses there. And back in the day, we let people kind of do that however they wanted. So a series of differently angled kind of miniature grids emerged. But you can see another thing that's happening here, which is to the north, Broadway is now running out of town. And you can see that it's on a collision path to meet with the Bowery. And where that intersection happens is also going to be of interest to our story. So this is a little bit of the state of play as we get to the time of the American Revolution and split off from the British and become our own country. After the Revolution, New York City quickly grows into the busiest commercial shipping port on the East Coast. Other changes start to happen that drive us to say the city is going to continue to expand. Maybe we should get organized and not simply let all these higgledy-piggledy little grids get together. And to do that, we form a commission. The New York City government tried to make a plan for the city several times, but people had too many vested interests. There were property owners, people with political influence, so they eventually kicked the question up to the state government in Albany, which made a commission that was authorized to lay out a plan for New York City. And if we ask ourselves, well, why at this juncture does this happen? Right around 1800, in those clashes of grids, we have some not so great conditions. The area where we filled in that freshwater pond, which became some nasty swampy ground, became a terrible slum neighborhood that we called the 5 Points. And if I have any gangs of New York fans here, you might recognize it. Here's a view of the 5 Points. John Randall, who was invited to the survey later, said that this was the worst of the area, and there were terrible things, right? Crooked, narrow streets with alleys and courts that were great fire risks and didn't have great ventilation, and people thought that there were risks of getting sick. So these are the kind of conditions that we want to improve on in our new plan. But there's another very important driving factor, which is that the population of New York City is increasing rapidly. I put this grid together, and you can see from just a couple hundred people back in Dutch days, the city had slowly grown to a couple thousand people in British times. And by the time of the Revolution, it got up to about 20,000 people. But after independence, that quickly grows to 30,000. By 1800, 80,000. By 1810, 120,000. Wow, this is really taking off. And you can see that if you just extrapolate this linear growth, the commissioners thought it was not unreasonable to assume that maybe 50 years later, in the distant future of 1860, the city might have as many as 400,000 people, right? They said it might be the biggest collection of people this side of China, right? Other people said, you're nuts. The city's never going to get that big. But this is what the commissioners decided to base their plan on. And we can see how it worked out. For starters, this was not the first time the city had made an attempt to do some expansion. After the war, we had a lot of war debts, and city government was an expensive business. So they circled back and said, you know, maybe people would pay money for those common lands between the Boston Post Road and the Bloomingdale Road. So a little bit earlier, back in 1796, they hired a Polish-American surveyor named Casimir Gurk and said, lay it out. He said, well, what kind of a layout you want? They said, I don't know, we just got to sell these lots off. What's a good size? 5 acres is pretty good. You could do a lot of stuff with it. You could have a farm, lay out 5-acre lots. So he puts in his 5-acre lots. He says, well, you know, people are going to have to get around between them. I guess we ought to have some streets. And he lays some uptown streets that he calls the East, Middle, and West roads. And the lots have a certain proportion that you're going to recognize. It's about 200 feet in the uptown direction, about 800 feet in the crosstown direction. And so this original commercial plan just to sell the lands off ends up having some significant influence on our later plan. City doesn't get around to implementing it, and a couple years later they circle back and say, oh yeah, we should look at that again. Get Mr. Girk back, and he said, well, I'm going to need a little help. I have a very nice guy here named Joseph Mangan who's going to help me with my survey. In 1803, they started to put a plan together, but sadly, Mr. Girk passed away before they finished the work. Mr. Mangan got a little bit beyond his mandate and started laying out a plan. If you look here, that kind of continued the existing conditions. He said, well, maybe on one side we could have a grid going this way, on the east side a grid going this way, and that would all kind of work itself out. If we had implemented the Mangan-Girk plan of 1803, we would have had a very different city, a much less organized city to get around. But the city once again shelved the plan and put it off until they put the commission together in 1807 that started the grid plan. And who are these commissioners? Well, they hired three guys. They hired a guy named Simeon DeWitt, who had been the chief surveyor of Washington's army during the Revolution and had become the chief surveyor for New York State. So he said, we got to know somebody who knows how to measure and lay things out. He's got the technical skill. They brought in a wealthy landowner from New Jersey who was far enough away from New York politics named John Rutherford. And if you know the places like East Rutherford, spelled a little bit differently, that's where he was from. But he's really there because he is a buddy of the guy who was in charge of the whole thing, a fellow by the name of Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris is one of the most, let's say, least known founding fathers who made contributions that a lot of people don't really, I think, appreciate. But they thought that he was a good, rational, level-headed guy who could run the show with the help of these two other folks. And I have to tell you, as an architect, I take a look at this and I'm like, okay, we got a surveyor, we got a wealthy guy, we got a politician. Where are the architects and urban planners? Where are the people who study this as their profession? We didn't hire anybody like that. We thought that these guys knew enough to make a plan that would be good enough for New York City. And let's take a little bit of a deeper look. I said that Gouverneur Morris, whose nickname was Gouv, was really the brains and power of the operation. He was an interesting fellow. As I mentioned, he's one of the founding fathers who contributed to a lot of things, but in his personal life, he was really known as kind of a rake. He kept getting in trouble, getting involved with married women. And later in life, if you met him, you would notice that he had a wooden leg. Now, we think he really got that in a carriage accident, but pretty soon a myth grew up that he'd gotten his wooden leg jumping out a second-store window to escape a jealous husband. But however he got it, the lady said that the wooden leg did not detract from his charm. And if you're particularly curious, you can go to the New York Historical Society on the Upper West Side where they have Gouv's wooden leg. But it was not just his amorous pursuits that we know him for. He was also involved in the Constitutional Convention and the drafting of the United States Constitution. And interestingly, one of the most important things he did was to write the final draft, which meant that he had power of final edits, what went into it, and he composed perhaps the best known part of the Constitution, which is the preamble. So if you know these words, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That's all the words of Gouverneur Morris. He was also buddies with some of the other founding fathers here in New York, like his friend Alexander Hamilton. And if you look at the top right, you can see a mural in DC that shows Gouv with his wooden leg, and next to him with a sword to show his martial character is his buddy Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton sadly managed to get himself embroiled with a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804 and get himself shot and killed in midlife. He was close enough that Gouv actually gave his eulogy at Trinity Church, and he was close enough to Hamilton's family that Eliza, his widow, said, I just can't bear to go on without Alex Gouv. You adopt the kids, I'm going to take my own life. Luckily, he was able to talk her out of that. But if you want to see the traces of the Morris family, you need to go no further than up to the Bronx, where we still have a neighborhood called Morrisania, and you can see an older view of that here. All right, so Gouv and the guys are tasked to make this plan. Let's see what kind of a plan they came up with. And if you want to get a sense of just how varied the land ownership is in Manhattan, this is one of what we call the Randall farm maps that shows you the angled Bloomingdale Road and the little strips of farm, because back in the day, you wanted a farm to have its front on the road and its back on the river, because that was the only way to transport produce and things like that, and how the new grid would interrupt it. But I have to take a step back and say, when I say grid plan, what do I really mean, right? Well, to do that, we could look at some basic geometry. if you have two lines, there's really only three ways that these lines can relate to each other. One, they can run perfectly parallel, like my example at the top, and never meet. Kind of boring, right? Or they could crash into each other. And in the vast bulk of cases, when two lines intersect, they form two different sets of angles, a greater angle and a lesser angle. But in one very special case where the lines are at 90 degrees, they form four separate angles that are all equal. We call these perpendicular lines, and we call those angles right angles, right? In fact, the old Greek term for this is orthogonal, ortho meaning correct, right? Now, I'm not necessarily saying that all other angles are wrong, but you're going to see in some ways these do have some special character. And a right-angled collection of lines makes a rectangular grid, which is one of the very few ways that you can make a consistently repeating pattern that will fill up a two-dimensional plane like a piece of land, right? Imagine you were going to tile the wall in your bathroom, right? Square tiles would be one way to go. Triangles will do it also, as will hexagons. I haven't seen anybody try to lay out a city based on hexagons just yet, although if you find some examples, by all means, let me know. And you can see that there's a lot of qualities to the regularity of the square or rectangular grid. But we were not the first people to think of this. In the Western world, we often look back to antiquity, to the Greeks and Romans. And there was a Greek planner by the name of Hippodamus who used it in towns like Miletus in Turkey. And we still call this in ancient times a Hippodamian plan. The Romans also used it in a lot of places. This is a town nowadays called Timgad in North Africa, where they built a colony. You can see how consistent that very square grid is. The Roman legions even laid out their camps in a grid plan, so that no matter where you were in the empire, whether you were in Germany or Gaul or some godforsaken place like Britain, when you laid out the camp, your tent was at the same street address in the camp. So you already felt a little bit like it was easy to navigate and you were home. But fast forwarding to America, New York is not even the first place here to use a grid plan. We had some older ones all the way back in 1682. William Penn had used it to lay out Philadelphia. And Mr. Oglethorpe did the same in Savannah in 1733. But if you look at these, you're going to notice that these grid plans are on a much smaller scale. And they also tend to have kind of subunits like neighborhoods, right, that organize themselves around parks or open spaces. So that was what Americans had been doing with the grid in cities. We had another fellow about the time of the Revolution who was a big fan, another one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, who among his other work outside of politics was an architect. And when we decided to sell off a little bit of territory out in what will become Ohio, he said, I have the perfect tool. Let's use a square grid. In fact, we'll make a 6-mile by 6-mile grid. We can subdivide it into lots to hold off. We'll reserve some land for schools and other public uses. And this worked so well that if you fly over the Midwest today, like the aerial photo of Kansas on the right, you'll often see a square grid just like this. Although interestingly, you'll see it's overlaid with circles, which are because of pivot agriculture, right? Where you have a central pivot to irrigate your fields. But the Jeffersonian grid's still very much there. All right, so those are all grid predecessors. But when our commissioners got together, they only left a little bit of written notes to justify themselves. But one of the things they said was, some people like to put fancy stuff in their grid, like circles, ovals, and stars. And we don't really think that those are so efficient or useful. They were thinking in particular of a plan that had been laid out for the new city of Washington, D.C., where we had hired a very fancy French urban planner by the name of Pierre L'Enfant, who used a grid but also overlaid diagonal avenues to create focal points like the Capitol and the White House. They said, we don't need any of that for New York. We're just going to make rectangles. And the plan that they came up with is effectively just a rectangular grid. And they said, people are going to ask us why. And I got to tell you, it's basically this. We make houses. The city we think is going to be mostly houses, right? They were still thinking it would have more of a residential character. Houses tend to be rectangular. So why not make rectangular blocks? Those are the cheapest and most convenient ways to go. So there is no high intellectual plan behind the grid. In a lot of ways, we can see it simply as a kind of a matrix to allow the easiest real estate transactions and development. But let's take a little closer look at the plan that they chose to make. For starters, they said, okay, we're going to make a decision here. We are going to go along the long axis of Manhattan Island. We're going to go parallel to it as much as possible. And remember, per my north arrow, that's not true north. So they said, let's see where we could make the first avenue that would go all the way up the island as far as we can get it to go. And we'll call that First Avenue. They then offset in the same 5-acre lot dimension all the way up through the numbers, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way over to 12th Avenue. Some folks might know that there has actually been a little bit of a 13th here and there. And interestingly, if you look at the layout of 4th, now Park, 5th and 6th Avenues, they correspond to the east, middle, and west roads very closely, not exactly, but very closely to the original Casimir Girk plan. But in Lower Manhattan, the commissioners ran into a little bit of a problem because we have a point that pokes out a little bit further east on what we call the Lower East Side. So as opposed to going to, I don't know, something like negative numbers, maybe they decided to shift to letters. And if you go down there, you will see an Avenue A, B, C, and D, which give their neighborhood one of its common nicknames, which of course is Alphabet City. Although folks familiar with Manhattan will know that Sutton Place and York Avenue do appear with slightly fancier names a little bit further uptown. So we've got the avenues, right? We've got one axis of our grid set. Now we're going to set some streets, right? And we could only begin at the edge of development, right? So Houston Street on the east side, Greenwich and Gansevoort on the west side are where we start. And just above Houston Street, we find the first place to make a relatively narrow, or not so long, First Street. And we put them on that closer 200-foot spacing, and they begin to march their way up the island. Interestingly, you might think that these very rational-minded commissioners would make a very rational-minded numbering scheme. They figured out that the streets needed to be at least 60 feet wide. That was in their charter. For the avenues, they went a little bit bigger to make them more gracious, more traffic, more ventilation at 100 feet wide. But they acknowledged that we would need to have some significant cross streets that should also be at that wider dimension. And as opposed to picking up regular numbers like 10, 20, 30, 40, they had to work around a number of existing conditions, and they ended up close, but not quite on that. So if you know your way around, you'll know that 14th Street, 23rd Street, 34th Street, 42nd Street are as close as they could get to that. Although if you look a little further uptown, you'll notice that at 86, 96, 106, they did hit the 10-foot spacing, but they couldn't get it quite onto even numbers. And interestingly, because these streets run the full length back and forth from 5th Avenue, if you know crosstown addresses, they are very predictable. 313 East 37th Street and 313 East 45th Street are going to be quite close to the same place east-west. But because the avenues had to start from different points where the city had developed so far, avenue addresses are not nearly as consistent. And if we want to get a little bit into the building blocks of this plan, I put here a typical block, our typical 5-acre block at 200 feet uptown, downtown, 800 feet east-west. These are not all quite the same. They're a little shorter over by the river where they thought that real estate would be more valuable. They could break it up a little bit more. They're a little bit longer. They get as long as 920 feet in the big midtown blocks. But, you know, if you walk around town, you can use these blocks as a pretty good shorthand, right? With our 200-foot dimension, if you walk about 20 blocks uptown, that's pretty close to a mile. I find that very useful myself. You can also see the width of the streets on the right, and the old New York streets and even the old New Amsterdam streets were very narrow. It was not uncommon to have a street just 30 feet wide. And back in the day, we used to build buildings about 5 or 6 stories tall. That was about as far as you wanted to walk up in stairs. So that made narrow streets that were kind of dark, right, overhanging with these buildings. So by making every street at least 60 feet wide, we got a lot more light into the plan, ventilation, and also, oh my gosh, we could have traffic that flowed in both directions on the street and the sidewalk. And on the avenues, you could even have multiple lanes of traffic going in either direction, and it would give it a much more gracious feel. But another reason thinking about houses and these block sizes is it was quite common to make a residential building lot 20 or 25 feet wide. And you will see lots on those dimensions all over Manhattan today. So you can see example of what a row house on a lot like that would be like. You would build it up 3, 4, 5 stories and even have a little bit of backyard. So this really becomes the DNA of the city as we see it. But you might look at this plan and say, well, you know, it's fine to have all this grid, but is there not going to be any relief from the grid? You didn't make any diagonal avenues. You didn't make any of those circles, stars, and ovals. How about some green space? The commissioners did put a little bit of green space in the plan, but they also said, Manhattan's an island. We've got this big, beautiful waterfront. And remember, back in 1810, all you have are sailing ships on the waterfront. That's a great place. People could enjoy that. We don't have to worry about parks quite that much. But they did sprinkle some in. And if you look at this map of the parks, the first thing that you're going to notice is basically none of these are familiar to us today because they really did not get implemented. But if you know your way around town, you might see some traces of them, right? On the Lower East Side, where Tompkins Square Park is today, they wanted to put a large public market. And because you had to transport goods by boat, they wanted to use a stream that came into the Lower East Side and make a canal for a big open market where all the farmers could bring their goods in. Second, they wanted to make a big military drilling ground because you had to muster troops in time of war. So, right down around the Murray Hill, Madison Square Park area, they wanted to make a huge place called the Parade. There's not a big park like that down there, right? Up around Rock Center, there were some botanic gardens that Mr. Elgin had put together, which eventually went to Columbia University. So that would have been there. On the west side, Bloomingdale Square, which also didn't really exist, but became the site of today's Lincoln Center. They did want to honor the late Alexander Hamilton and have a place for an observatory where they also thought they could put a reservoir, because even then they realized that surrounded by salt water, Manhattan would never have enough fresh water to serve the population. So they already had begun thinking about bringing water in from Westchester and further upstate in the Catskills, right? Manhattan Square, a little further up, also didn't occur. But if you know where the American Museum of Natural History is, we did end up using that site for something. So although these never became parks that we really knew, they did have some influence on the city as it is today. Okay, so now we've got the plan. The first thing we have to do is figure out how to get the plan onto the actual island. We have to do some surveys, right? And the fellow who we hired was the pupil of Simeon DeWitt, his star pupil up in Albany, a guy by the name of John Randall Jr. And Simeon said, this is the guy for the job. I got to tell you, he's super precise. He doesn't go buy surveying instruments from any old shop, not even the high-end shops. He makes his own instruments. And he makes a point of making his instruments out of materials and with a design that they don't expand and contract very much when the weather gets colder or warmer. And he says that he can measure an inch by a stretch over a mile long that would vary by less than an inch. So John Randall Jr. gets the job. And the first thing he has to do while they're still coming up with the plan is document all the existing conditions of Manhattan, right? So he does that. It takes him a couple of years. He makes his farm maps. And then they come back and they hand him the plan and say, go put a marker at the corner where every single block and avenue will be. Northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, whatever it's going to be, Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, put them down there. So he puts these 3-foot-high marble posts in place at each of those corners. But he's not received very well because all this land, the bulk of it is in private lands. So he's got permission from the city, but people are not happy about them coming, putting these markers on their land. There are famous stories of him being run off. People set their dogs on him, threw cabbages at him. There were lawsuits, all kinds of stuff like that. And he ran into another problem, which is that the very solid bedrock of Manhattan Island in the rocky central area here of the common lands had a lot of outcroppings. So where he couldn't put a marker, he blew a hole in the rock with dynamite and then secured in place with molten lead a little iron bolt. Now, interestingly, most of these markers are long gone, right, because they've been superseded by the development of the city. But because we had never conceived of Central Park at the time of the plan, like this photo that I took, if you know where to go certain places, you can still find a couple of Mr. Randall's bolt markers. And just to give you a sense of what the change in ownership was like, this is the first of the farm maps on the Lower East Side. North Street at the bottom is what we know as East Houston Street today. And if you see the street names south of it, like Allen Street, Orchard Street, Ludlow Street, if you know that neighborhood, they're all there. But north of it was all different kinds of land ownership that had to be recut up in order to accommodate the grid. So we had to have thousands and thousands of transactions where the city would buy up land or pieces of land, and people also maybe had to buy other lots to reassemble something that worked with the grid. And interestingly, every once in a while, the city council, who still own the Randall Farm maps, will put them out. This is actually the borough president's office in Lower Manhattan. They were here for an event called Open House New York a couple years ago, and I got a chance to see them. And when you see these maps laid out, they are over 50-foot long. You can see they had to break them up onto a couple tables, but you can actually physically go and see the maps that Randall and his team made all the way back in the early 1800s. Okay, so the grid has now been laid out, and even if somewhat reluctantly, people have had it measured out across the island. But now we have to fill in the grid, and the filling into the grid is only going to happen as the city expands. So what the city government does is it selectively picks areas to do what's called opening up streets. That's when they do the purchasing of land in that area. That's when they do the grading that has to happen on the streets. And remember, Manhattan has a pretty varied topography early on. This is a view as late as 1861, right? Almost 50 years later at 2nd Avenue, looking uptown from 42nd Street. You can see not only the variation of the land itself, but look at this house on a giant outcropping, right? Somebody's going to have to pay to dynamite all that rock to get that land down to street level. So similarly, here in Midtown, you can see just how irregular the land ownership was, just how these angled streets and lots had to be reworked for the new grid. If you have a sharp eye, you might notice up at the top, we get up to 40th Street, where we have something called the distributing reservoir. Observatory Square with its reservoir never happened, but when we began pumping water in via the Croton Aqueduct, we did put a reservoir there. And sharp eyes will notice that 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, where it used to be, is now the site of the New York Public Library. And so there was a lot of disruption and change. One of the things that you might find is that your house might be right in the middle of the path of 5th Avenue. So we developed technology for people to move houses. And you can see on the left a house being jacked up and moved over, right, on these kind of skids to get it out of the path of the street. You can see some of the demolition going on right down again by 42nd and 2nd. You can see at the bottom left some of the irregular topography. And, you know, some folks were not so happy about all these changes being made. And we have an interesting quote from a guy who owned a big estate over in what would become Chelsea on the west side, a guy named Clement Clark Moore. Few people know him from his real estate interests, but if you know the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas that starts off, "'Twas the night before Christmas," he's the fellow who penned it. He did not have nice things to say about the commissioners. He said that these guys are men who would have cut down the 7 hills of Rome. Nothing will remain that does not conform to their plan. So this is a little bit of a rant, but I really don't know what he had to complain about, because Moore took advantage of the new plan to divide up his estate into lots and made a lot of money on real estate by selling off most of what would become the neighborhood of Chelsea today. Made him a very wealthy man. We have some other views here as we get later into the 1800s. You can see the Upper West Side still pretty rural at Amsterdam and 70th on the top left. Folks know the Dakota, which is now surrounded by other buildings and high rises, which really does look like it's off in Dakota in this 1800s photo. At the bottom left, down at Madison and 55th, you can see exactly how much grading had to be done. It wasn't just outcroppings. A lot of land ended up below street level, and people had to buy fill in order to get your front door up to the level of the new grid. And at the bottom right, you can see what used to be train lines that ran out of Grand Central all the way uptown that we finally covered over and made an extra wide avenue that up there we came to call Park Avenue, right? If everybody asks you where 4th Avenue is, we just rebranded it. But interestingly, New York City being the commercial town it is, there were people there to take advantage of all of this change. And from the mid-1800s up into the early 1900s, we had a very corrupt political organization that ran the city with an iron fist, known as Tammany Hall. And of course, the most notorious embezzler, right, grafter, briber of all this crew is William Boss Tweed, right? He embezzled over $2 billion in today's money, although he did eventually get busted for it and ended up dying in debtor's prison down on Ludlow Street. But you can see this Thomas Nast cartoon on the bottom right depicting the Tammany Hall crew as vultures preying on the bones of the New York City Treasury. It's called Let Us Pray, but not P-R-A-Y, P-R-E-Y. So what Tweed and his cronies would do is they would get to make the decisions what stretch of streets to open up next. And before it was advertised, they would make a discreet connection to all their buddies and say, hey, Go buy up some land along 6th Avenue in the 30s. Pay whatever the guy asks. Don't worry about it. Just pay his price. Trust me. A year from now, you're going to make 5 times that. And so there was a lot of graft exploited in slowly filling in the grid as well. But eventually, we did fill it in. And by the end of the 1800s, we've gotten fairly far uptown. The commissioners only laid out the grid to 155th Street originally because they said, oh, look, I know we said there'd be 400,000 people, but, up in Harlem, they're not going to have houses and stuff like that densely built up there probably for centuries, right? So the grid became the landscape of Manhattan. And as I mentioned, it's so consistent, it's so rigorous that a lot of times what we notice is not the grid itself, but the things that are not according to the grid. And you will recognize, of course, here the famous Flatiron Building down at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue, where it intersects with Broadway. And that is one of the generators of these interesting variations. So in order to track those, let's take a look at the commissioner's plan map, the one that we've been using here in our sideways orientation with all of its features. And let me fast forward it to replace it with the map of today, which looks similar, but not quite the same. Immediately, some things are going to pop out on this map that did not go according to plan. And one of the first ones that I see is this kind of rambling, angling path that has parts of the old Wickassic Native American Trail, parts of the British Bloomingdale Road that we kept as Broadway. So Broadway was just in so much heavy use that although we got rid of a lot of things like the Boston Post Road is gone, Broadway remains. And interestingly, although we said we were not going to have any of those circles, stars, or ovals, it is where Broadway intersects our avenues that we did end up getting interesting public spaces that we call squares. Although, as Saturday Night Live pointed out recently, they're really triangles, right? So if you know Union Square, Herald Square, Times Square, all the way up to Verdi Square on the Upper West Side, Columbus Circle, these are all generated by the path of Broadway. And Broadway creates, some people call them bow ties because it's kind of a triangle above the cross street and below the cross street, very familiar intersections that become some of our significant public places, but really were supposed to go away if we had implemented the grid in its totality. Additionally, the grid follows the orientation of the island. Uptown goes parallel to the axis of Manhattan. We chose not to go truly east-west. But there's a couple places where you can see true east-west streets, and one of them is in the East Village, a short stretch called Stuyvesant Street. And if we go back to Dutch days, you may remember the Boweries, the farms and orchards of Dutch New Amsterdam were located in this area. And the Director General of New Netherland got the nicest farm, Bowery #1, and Peter Stuyvesant, another fellow who we remember for having a wooden leg Gouverneur Morris style, had his in the East Village. And the Stuyvesant family decided to lay out the paths from the post road over to their farms truly east-west. Eventually, all of these get replaced by the grid, except for one little stretch. And if you go from, let's say, Cooper Square over to 2nd Avenue, you will still see this angled stretch of Stuyvesant Street. And St. Mark's and the Bowery Church, which replaced the original Stuyvesant family chapel, is located on that angled street. Stuyvesant himself is actually buried there. So this is a great opportunity to stand on a block and imagine what a different Manhattan we would have had if we decided to take this east-west orientation for the whole grid. Additionally, some of those interesting squares as you move up have great stuff going on. And there's one in not too far from my neighborhood called Union Square. And if you know Union Square and you're curious like me, you might have thought at some point, how did it get that name? And I thought, like a lot of places with Union in the name, maybe it had to do something with the Civil War, right? Support the cause of the Union. But in fact, the story goes back to that crash that we foresaw back on our British map, which is that Broadway and the Bowery are going to hit each other when we get up to about 17th Street. And they're at such a teeny narrow angle that they leave a little wedge of land in between them that people started to call the Forks. So when we got up to that point, we said, this is really not an efficient way to have this little needle of land. We should replace this with a park at the union of Broadway and the Bowery, the juncture of those two streets. So that becomes today's Union Square, which is one of the most beautiful spots in the neighborhood. I think we still have a great green market, even though it didn't happen in the East Village. You can see some images here of just how rural and out of town it was back in the 1800s. In fact, at the top right in 1828, you can still see the forks coming together, that very narrow wedge of land. But by 1850, this has already become a thickly settled district with a very elegant park in it. And then, if we go a little further uptown, there's another park in this neighborhood called Gramercy Park, and it sits along an avenue that doesn't have numbers. It's not Second Avenue, it's not Third Avenue, it's called Lexington. We owe this variation to a real estate developer by the name of Samuel Ruggles, who bought up the north end of the old Stuyvesant farm and wanted to sell it off to make a very genteel housing district. And in order to do that, not only did he decide to create a private park that you would only have a key to if you bought one of the residences facing it, but he wanted more street frontage so he could make more expensive lots. So he subdivided his land in between Third and what was originally called Fourth, now Park Avenue or Park Avenue South, and he created the beginning of Lexington Avenue. City thought that this was such a great idea that we could make more money doing it, that they even did it with the next avenue over, which they called Madison after President Madison. So if you want to know why we have a bunch of chopped, short, half-length blocks on the east side, it's because of these later changes to the 1811 plan. And at the foot of Madison Avenue, we have a park that we now today know as Madison Square Park. But if we look back, this is the area where the 1811 plan thought that we would have a parade ground. And again, I have up, down, up to show you this. They thought that the parade ground would be so big that it would run from 23rd Street all the way up to 34th Street, and then it would run as far west as 7th Avenue, over to where Penn Station is today. But when the city looked at the actual costs of acquiring all this land and then losing the tax base slowly, in each iteration, it seemed like the parade ground got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until the only scrap of it that survived today is the relatively moderately sized Madison Square Park. But I've overlaid the parade ground in today's city to give you a sense of just how vast it would have been. And if we think about it, in many ways, conceptually, this was a bit of a forerunner of the idea that would eventually become Central Park. Another interesting thing to notice here is I've traced the original east side coastline of Manhattan in its crooked yellow path, and you can see just how much we've expanded the city with landfill, right? Making new land in Manhattan is a very profitable business. Madison Square Park has got a lot of wonderful features around it. Interestingly, Fourth Avenue, which we now call Park Avenue South, used to be the path of the train that came down into the city. And when the city had only come as north as 14th Street, the train depot was there. It then moved a little further north to 26th Street, and the terminal building, the end building of the train, sat right adjacent to Madison Square Park at its northeast corner. We finally moved that up to 42nd Street. It becomes Grand Central Terminal. But the old building that was there was a big old building that looked like it could be useful for interesting stuff like entertainment, and it got bought by a consortium of investors, including a guy by the name of P.T. Barnum, who turned it into a recreational entertainment facility, nice big space with some nice landscaping. It was adjacent to Madison Square Park, and the landscaping was almost like a garden. So we decided to call it Madison Square Garden. You can see the purpose-built building that replaced the train hall there, designed by McKim, Mead, and White. Stanford White managed to get himself shot and killed by a jealous lover. What is it with the rakes in this presentation? Not just Gouverneur Morris, but that is the original thing. If you ever look today and say, why is Madison Square Garden called that? It's not in Madison Square, and it's not, a garden. This is the case. So I want to also mention, you know that the city was developed up to certain points when the grid plan came in. That included much of today's West Village. But as the city continued to expand in the early 1900s, we decided we had to make some changes to the West Village. We had built rail tunnels under the Hudson, and the Pennsylvania Railroad had built what was originally a beautiful station over by Penn Station, although we later knocked it down. And we decided we had to make some connections down to the waterfront, so we cut avenues into the West Village, extending 7th Avenue and 6th Avenue. And you can see here the path of the 7th Avenue extension through the angled grids that had been the Warren Farm and the Trinity Church Farm, which were already complicated enough. So if you've ever walked down 7th Avenue South and said, this looks like a bunch of shrapnel, all these little triangular lots and exposed sidelines, that's exactly what happened. In fact, we mismeasured one lot that we wanted to buy from the Hess family, and they were so spiteful about it, they made a little triangle that you can still see down by Phil's Cigars that says, hey, the city never paid us for this little triangle of land. They sold it to Village Cigars a couple years later, but you can still walk down and see that today. This happens about 1915, and they also use the opportunity to run the 7th Avenue subway line underneath it. That worked so well that they decided to do the same thing a couple years later in 1925 and extend 6th Avenue down from today's Washington Square Park all the way to Canal Street. They wanted to do that to hook up with a brand new feature that they'd put in under the Hudson down there, which was the Holland Tunnel. And they wanted car traffic to be able to get down easily through the West Village into the Holland Tunnel, but you can see the irregular path they had to carve out in order to get it done. They ended up displacing about 10,000 of what were mostly Italian immigrant residents of the area at the time. And you can see at the top right the amount of disruption they did, because once again, they said, hey, we could put the ACE subway lines in. We'll use the cut and cover method. They excavated the whole street. So for a while, there were just these little bridges you could cross, and you can get a sense of the opening in 1930 of the new broad street. And if you walk down there today, you can see my photo at the bottom right, shot down looking up from Canal Street. You can still see the path. If you ever wonder why the blank sidewall of a building is exposed to 6th Avenue, it's because we sliced right through those blocks. All right, so those are significant changes, but when you looked at this map, maybe the first thing that jumped out at you was this giant actual rectangle of green space called Central Park. Well, the parade ground never happened. A lot of the other little parks never got implemented. And by the middle of the century, people were like, we have steamships on the waterfront now. People are burning coal. There's all kinds of stuff. It's not so nice to walk over there. We really could use a park, right? And with help from a newspaper editor by the name of William Cullen Bryant, who got a park named after himself, we hired some folks named Olmsted and Vaux, who had a plan called the Green Sward in our competition, and made a giant park which forever separated the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side of Manhattan from each other. This, of course, becomes an iconic spot in its own right. You can see even this view back around the Civil War. It was actually the first place that we put our reservoir in place before we moved it downtown. And I see Andrea is mentioning Seneca Village. In fact, there was a fair amount of property ownership in this area. We did have to buy all this up. Seneca Village is noted because it was one of the settlements that African Americans had closer to the Upper West Side, although there were also Irish immigrants and the like that got displaced. Now, this was not a great thing, and there are plenty of other displacements that had a lot of injustice to them. But what we can say is the city has used a process called eminent domain for many years. You don't get a choice of selling your property, but they do pay you what a court considers to be a fair price for it. And as I mentioned, if you know where to look in Central Park, because it was never part of the grid plan, you can still find a couple of those markers. And they've done a beautiful renovation at the north end of the park with a great pool, if folks want to check that out nowadays. All right. So those are some, at least, of the most significant variations on the grid. I want to talk about now the legacy and the aftermath of the grid. This is one of my favorite New Yorker covers. They're celebrating their 100th anniversary this year. This one is from 1976 by Saul Steinberg. It's called A View of the World from 9th Avenue. And it shows the somewhat parochial view of New Yorkers. It features the street grid, right, in the foreground, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue. The street grid of Manhattan takes up as much space as the rest of the world, which consists only of a foreshortened United States plus Mexico and Canada, and then off in the distance of the horizon, China, Japan, and Russia. So I love that the street grid gets prominence in this rather myopic view of the world. But a lot of changes happened after the plan was put in place in 1811. And the one that the commissioners could never have anticipated was we began to have huge waves of immigration from the rest of the world, not just from Europe, also from places like China. But in Europe, people like the Irish, the Italians, Eastern European Jews, Greeks, and others flooded into the city in huge numbers, transforming not only the character of the population, but also the size of the population. So I want to take this opportunity to bring you back to that graph that we started off with. And you can see the dashed line at the bottom showing that crazy idea that by 1860, we might have as many as 400,000 people in New York City. I've put at the top in a solid line the actual population in 1860, which was almost 1.2 million people. The city was not growing on a linear scale. It was growing exponentially. So taking the grid up to 155th Street turned out to be a pretty prescient idea, and we eventually would expand the grid much further and do variations out in the 5 boroughs, which would become part of New York City later. So I would say the commissioners were pretty vindicated by the actual expansion of the city. The other thing that they could never have anticipated was the development of new technologies, right? Steam power was in its infancy at the time of the grid plan. Robert Fulton hadn't even started his steam ferry across to Brooklyn, but pretty soon it's not just steam trains. We bury electric trains under the ground and have a subway system which can run independent of the street grid if it wants to. No longer do we have horse and carriage. Now we have automobiles using those rectangular streets. Our ships get so big that they move away from the coastline of Manhattan. We don't have a lot of shipping facilities right in Manhattan anymore. They move to Red Hook in Brooklyn and Port Newark in New Jersey. And then we invent air travel. And suddenly our 3 regional airports become just as important. So the grid plan that served what was going on in 1811 has to serve now the changes in technology, right? We do things like build elevated highways, the FDR, the West Side Highway. And if Robert Moses had his way, we would even have a couple more. But there's one invention that I think changes the grid very radically in a way that certainly no one could have predicted. And that's that a fellow by the name of Elisha Otis makes a way to have a safe lifting platform called an elevator. Now, we'd had mechanical steam-driven lifts before, but these things were thought to be death traps. And at the top left, you can see Mr. Otis giving a shocking demonstration in the Crystal Palace, which was actually an exhibition space that was right next to the old Croton Reservoir, right where Bryant Park is today. And he had his assistant cut the cord, and everyone thought he would plummet to his death, but he demonstrated he'd put a new safety brake in place, and he said, you can make these platforms into something safe for everyday use. And pretty soon, the Otis safety elevator becomes the first vertical transportation other than stairs in buildings. And you can see here, I've overlaid the skyline over time. If we go back to the 1870s, we have our small buildings, we have our tall masted ships, and the thing you can see rising in the foreground that's bigger than them, so much bigger, is the tower of the Brooklyn Bridge. But after the elevator and steel frame construction, pretty soon we get skyscrapers. And in 1921, looking from the other direction, you can see the Singer sewing machine building, sadly no longer with us. In 1932, that has been joined by the Woolworth building on the left, still there on Broadway, and by the Bank of Manhattan building, still there at 40 Wall Street. And in 1998, we have more and more and more skyscrapers. Here, running out of my frame, of course, are the original Twin Towers. So the grid was always thought as running in 2 dimensions, right? Just like tiling a wall. But now we see that the grid is getting extruded farther and farther into the 3rd dimension, which has had a huge impact on the character of the island. So that brings us up to today. And I thought that we might end our romp through history and the grid with looking at what people's reactions were. And like I said, they were negative and positive. We have a lot of negative reactions from not long afterward and from some familiar people. Edgar Allan Poe, who we know from his spooky stories, wrote for the Columbia Spy a little column called Doings in Gotham, which was originally an ironic name for New York City. It actually means goat town. It was like, oh, our little goat town. And now, of course, everybody says Gotham. And he says that the magnificent places in the city are doomed. Pretty soon, every pier will be densely desecrated by buildings of brick. Now, it's not clear whether he is protesting development in general or the grid specifically, but the grid is certainly facilitating that desecration. And Frederick Law Olmsted, who we know from Central Park's design, said that no city is more unfortunately planned in terms of metropolitan attractiveness, right? I think he would have liked to have seen some of those circles, stars, and ovals that Washington, D.C. got. And then we have another famous author named Henry James, who grew up in New York in the 1870s, 1880s, then moved to London for a while and came back after the turn of the century. And when he sees what the grid has continued to do, he calls it the primal topographic curse of Manhattan Island, right? And he says it means that no happy accident, no interesting thing is ever going to happen as this relentlessly charges its way up the island. But over time, the grid began to have more and more fans, and I gathered some maybe more recent positive comments. Interestingly, on the 200th anniversary of the 1811 grid, we had a lot of stuff that was written about it, and Edward Glaser, in his book Triumph of the City, said, you know, the grid harnesses the energy of Manhattan, right? He says, yeah, it might be beautiful to look at, you know, this plaza here, there, or whatever. He says, but the grid in Manhattan takes the flowing energy that makes the city work and brings it into channels, right? So it's really kind of harnessing that energy. The author Roland Barthes said, you know, it's kind of interesting. Sorry, I've got a little bit of lightning going on here. Because all the grids are the blocks are so relentlessly equal. No matter where you are, uptown, downtown, midtown, north side of the block, south side of the block, you kind of get a sort of an equal chunk, and you can sort of spiritually feel that no matter how humble your little piece is, you are spiritually or poetically like a little owner of a piece of what he calls the capital of the world. And interestingly, when the Times decided to write things up, Michael Kimmelman said to them, not only is the grid super easy for navigation, that we take it very much for granted, and we can even use it to measure distances and the like. He says the grid, like a net, binds New Yorkers together in the same way that their shared identity as New Yorkers does. So he also gave us a way to show that. And I think that we would agree that Manhattan just would not be the Manhattan that we know without the grid. Maybe if the Girk-Mangan plan had gone, it would have been a city more like Boston with irregular streets where you really have to know your way, not just in the West Village. But it became the city that we come to understand today. So I think if we look back again at these crosstown streets and avenues, our initial view, we can appreciate them now, understanding all the planning and effort that went into making them. So with that in mind, I would love to turn it over to your questions and answers. And I'd also like to mention that if you were interested in any of the points that we touched on going through here, I have put a little grid quiz together. If you want to test your knowledge, you can use the link if you want to copy it down that I have there. It's bit.ly/1811quiz. Or if you got your phone out, you should be able to just scan that QR code, and that will also allow you to test your knowledge. But Tuckahoe Library team, I'd like to turn it back over to you and open it up if we have any questions from our Westchester crowd.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Hodgetts. If you have a question, you may either write it in the chat, or if you'd like to speak it out, please make a note in the chat that you'd like to ask it with your voice, and I can unmute you. So go on ahead. We'll do them first come, first serve.
That sounds good. And I'm just looking through the chat itself, and I'm not seeing any written questions that were dropped in as we went along. So we can just start off with whatever anyone might like to ask.
Absolutely.
And I found it interesting, we were talking about the Bronx earlier, having been Jonas Bronx farm for Elizabeth. And I know we have some folks who are further uptown. If you get into the history of New Amsterdam, particularly, there's a wonderful book that I would recommend by the author Russell Shorto, which is called The Island at the Center of the World, which is all about Dutch Manhattan. And he will introduce you to a character by the name of Adrian van der Donk, who was a young gentleman, and that was his nickname. People would call him that. He bought a little bit of land just on the other side of the river, and in Dutch, the young gentleman was the Jonkheer. So people say, well, I'm going to go up to the Jonkheer's land today. And of course, if you know anybody in Yonkers, that becomes what that turned into. All right, thank you for your nice comments, Alan. And Nancy has got a stickler, which is, I always know I'm going to run into the limits of my knowledge, which was how much did it cost and how was it paid for? Well, the cost of the commission and the survey was relatively modest, although they were paid, right? But what did happen is the city continually had to buy and sell land over time. And Nancy, I'm embarrassed to say, I really don't know if anyone's ever reckoned what the net was. I know that we had to raise funds out of things like taxes and fees in order to purchase it. But remember that the city was also selling off the common land. So I would tend to think that there was as much sale by the city as there was purchase, and that we probably did not take on all that much expense for the grid plan itself. But don't quote me on that. That would be some homework that I would need to give you a better question. All right. So Elizabeth is back asking us if Robert Moses had any impact on the grid. Okay, so Moses is a character who we know from the 1950s and 60s, who becomes the Parks Commissioner in New York City, but decides he's really interested in highways. Say, Rob, you got a whole job taking care of the parks. You go, no, we're going to put some nice landscaping. There'll be parkways, right? So he's very interested in how the automobile can improve the city. So Moses did not have an impact on the grid plan itself, but his highways would eventually change it very significantly. And if we look at Manhattan, The highways ended up being on the periphery, right? We no longer have a commercial waterfront. So, like a lot of cities, we thought that that was the most useful place to put them. So, the elevated FDR on the east side is Robert Moses' work. And the West Side Highway predates Moses. It was actually an elevated highway that was called the Miller Highway for many years, but it became structurally unsound in the 1970s and we had to tear it down. Interestingly, Moses had lost a lot of public trust by then. He'd done things like put the BQE in place, which slashed up a lot of neighborhoods. You likely know that there's a lot of economic and racial inequity in where these went, that he even wanted to take out the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. So when he came back and said we should move the West Side Highway out and bury it under the river in tunnels, people came and pushed back against him. His Westway plan never happened on that side. He also thought it would be good to connect the West Side and the East Side along the path of today's Houston Street with a raised Lower Manhattan Expressway, or LOMEX. You can Google that and see the renderings. That is an absolute horror that everybody is glad never happened. So yes, Robert Moses definitely did have impact, but I would say mostly at the periphery of Manhattan Island itself. Oh, and thank you, and Sandy from Alphabet City over in Avenues A, B, C, and D on the Lower East Side. Just imagine, Sandy, if that market that we see at the bottom left of the plan here had occurred, you could have a beautiful green market and a fabulous canal, maybe a little bit like Venice, although I'm not sure that East River water compares, that could have ventilated your neighborhood. Although, interestingly, if you're on the Lower East Side, we did eventually begin to have smaller centralized covered markets that were run by the city. And Essex Market, a little bit further down, is in fact a city-owned market that you could probably walk down to and check out. Is the farmhouse on Broadway in Inwood still open to the public? That's a good question, Vicenta. I don't actually know, and I'm not sure the house you're talking about. There is the Morris Jumel Mansion that is up there, which has some connection. And there's also the Hamilton Grange, some houses that got moved over. So I do know that there are at least two nice early houses that you can visit on the Upper West Side, and they will give you some sense of just what an absolutely rural area that used to be. Ah, all right. And Faith is giving some thought as to how to talk about this with eighth graders. Well, I will be very interested. I'd love to see what you might come up for them. For me, I think that the geometry of the grid is a great inspiration, that you can use some grid paper or draw some grid lines or cut things up into squares and think about how that might change some other piece that you laid it on top of. And the Cross Bronx. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. The many sins of Robert Moses. Absolutely. And interestingly, if you look at the map that I've got up here, one of the things I didn't mention back in Dutch days, we talked about cutting down Bayard Mount to fill in the Collect Pond, which created the swampy Five Points neighborhood. But if you look at the big green parade ground right here, just to its right, you will notice a big rise. The Dutch called that natural rise the Inklenberg. And eventually, when that became the British Murray family's estate, we came to know that as Murray Hill. And I told you that the train ran up the old 4th Avenue, which eventually became Park Avenue, but the old steam trains couldn't make it up Murray Hill. So they cut a rock cut that let them run at grade level. They didn't have to go up that steep slope. It was called the Murray Hill Rock Cut. And interestingly, that ran just south of Grand Central Station on Park Avenue. After a while, people said, we don't want this smelly open train cut. Couldn't you roof that over? They said, well, yeah, I guess you can make something nice. You can make some little gardens. Oh, it almost looks like a park. So if you want to know how 4th Avenue became Park Avenue, it is the stretch between 32nd Street and Grand Central that originally gave it the name. This is why Park Avenue addresses start south of Grand Central at 32nd Street, although we eventually named the other part of it Park Avenue South. And you can still see what is now a car tunnel running into that area. Well, all right. With that, I think we covered some pretty good ground. And I would love to stay in touch. If people want to follow up with me independently, you can get me by email or on social media here. And I'm always happy to continue the conversation in whatever way people may think interesting. And if you follow my link tree, you might see some of my other presentations and activities, or even tours here in Manhattan. And with that, Tuckahoe Library team, I'll turn it over back to you.
Okay. Um, it looks like I do have one more question here
Oh,
from Saul
yes,
M. Isn't Vincenta G discussing the Dickman house? And Vincenta confirms,
yes.
yes, she is.
Very nice. Whoa, and we have Andrea writing a speculative science fiction. Very interesting. Ooh, I cannot point you to anything in terms of things like ley lines, but I would suggest that you might look back at Native American sacred geography as one way of seeing how they might have perceived that. For me, from the geological side, understanding the scraping of the glaciers and the physical way that this landscape was actually made raises a lot of interest for me. And if you want to think about how different this landscape was, right, for starters, you can go back to a time when we are covered by thousands of feet of ice, right? And then when the ice deposits its terminal moraine, there's a period of time when this entire area is covered by water as a lake, trillions and trillions of gallons of water. And one of the interesting parts of that for me is before they break through at the Narrows, there was a point in time when you could have walked from Brooklyn to Staten Island along that ridge of land. So if you go to Brooklyn Heights or if you take the Staten Island ferry over, look all the way across the harbor to where you see that projecting land and just think that that entire piece of earth was removed when the glaciers broke through.
All
Oh,
right.
Elaine, I keep getting more here. Elaine wants to know how the city will evolve in the future. Well, the city will continue to get denser and more expensive. You need look no further than the so-called needle towers or super talls that are along Central Park South now. These are buildings that are over 1,000 feet tall, many of which have only one apartment per floor. They are so hyper luxury that many people are calling that billionaires row. So the sky line will continue to get denser and denser and denser, and you can find a lot of other urban planning projections. But the other thing we can say is we know that we are in a time of sea level rise, and the city will have to continue to respond to that. We have a number of projects in place now, including East River Park, where they have raised the land 10 feet. In fact, I was watching a science fiction show called The Expanse. I don't know if anybody knows it, where they have an aerial shot of New York, which has got an enormous seawall along it. People recently have been floating a plan to extend Lower Manhattan all the way down to subsume Governor's Island, go down to the harbor, but I don't know if I would put my money on that going in that particular direction.
That should do it. Mr. Hodges, I wanted to thank you again for coming so much. It was a great presentation. And I just wanted to say one final thank you to the Irvington, Mamaroneck, New Rochelle, and Lewisboro libraries. You guys made this possible, so thank you so much. And with that, we're going to say goodnight. Thank you so much for coming. Take
It
care,
was a
everybody.
pleasure meeting you all. I see you out in the audience, Hank Pole. Very nice to see you there. Good night, and it was very enjoyable.
Take care.